Howdy, folks. Welcome to another episode of Cedar Craft. So today we're going to go back to looking at this minimal, sort of small demo example of a feature in a hypothetical photo sharing app that'll let us look at some features of Cedar. In particular, one of the issues we talked about the past couple videos are mistakes you can make. And today I wanted to show some things in Cedar that can help us avoid those mistakes. So just to recap, here we have a really simple policy. We just got one. It says that any principal can view any resource as long as that principal is in the viewers of that resource. Okay, so that's our policy. Pretty easy. As we'll see, it's still possible to make some mistakes there. And whenever we try to check a policy, it's against the entity store. And so the entities, again, just to recap, are sort of the authorization relevant state of your application. And this gets packaged up and sent along with your authorization request to interpret the policy. So of course this has things like, what are the user groups? In this case, we've got a nature lovers user group and an administrator user group. It also has what the users are. That includes sort of, maybe what groups they're in this example. And we also have the resources, in this case photos that have IDs, as well as a list of user groups that we expect to be able to view that photo. Right? So whenever we send the request, we're going to send the entities along with it. And here we just have a couple of requests that we'll check. We want to know if Alice can view the tree photo and whether Bob can view the mountain photo. And we expect this one to go through because Alice is in the nature lovers group and the nature lovers are allowed to view the tree photo, but we expect Bob's to not go through because Bob isn't in the nature lovers group and so he shouldn't be able to view mountain. So let's check that real quick. Make sure everything is working as expected. And sure enough, Alice is allowed to view it and Bob is not. So that's great. If we go back to the code though, we saw that it's possible to make mistakes, like maybe I'm tired and instead of putting principal here, I put it here and sort of swap these around, right? So now if I run this, I believe it will still just run, but we get two deny decisions. So we made this sort of silly mistake, basically a type error, over here in our code by swapping resource and principal. But everything ran, we just got denies. So we want to avoid that kind of mistake. Now I will note there are some mistakes you can make that Cedar will always check. So if I do something like start accessing attributes of an entity starting with a root that doesn't make sense, like there is no principles in scope. There's no such thing. In this case, if I run it, I do get a no decision result, which indicates that something went wrong. So you always want to watch out for that. You should check the decisions that come back from Cedar to make sure it's an allow or deny. But even if it is a deny, that doesn't necessarily mean you didn't make a mistake. So what we want to look at is validation in Cedar. Let's make sure we fix this back up. What we want to look at is this set of tools Cedar provides for doing validation that will help us avoid these kinds of mistakes. So this is going to be a two-step process, or maybe three steps, I guess, actually. The first thing that we're going to do is we want to factor out our policies and entities. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the command line tools for Cedar, and we'll see how to run those. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to actually validate policies and check them and see how that can help us catch these kinds of mistakes. So let's dig into step one here and factor out the policies and the entities. So here's another version, and all I've done is I've put the policies into a separate file called policies.cedar. We're going to look at that in a second. It's literally the exact same code. And we've also made another file, a JSON file for the entities called cedarentities.json. And that is a slightly different format, but it's very, very close to the entities we had. So first up, our policies file here, we just have literally copied and pasted the policy we had over here in v0. We're allowing any principal to view any resource when the principal is in resource.viewers. Sure enough, that's what the policy here says. And then Cedar entities is again super similar. If we go back and look at what our entities looked like here in Python, when we just typed them out literally in the program, right? We just had these sort of records. And that's also what we have here in Cedar entities, right? We just sort of pasted them in. Okay. Now this already has some advantages. It turns out there's a very nice VS Code mode that can highlight these things and do some validation and checking for us right here in VS Code. We'll show that next week, but wanted to mention it up front. And also our file now is a lot cleaner and simpler, right? We sort of separated these things out. We can edit them separately. We can have separate special plugins and tools to support them. And so our overall application code is sort of less cluttered. We've done a better job separating concerns. Okay, so now let's actually get those command line tools installed. And for that, we're actually going to use Rust. If you don't have Rust installed yet, it's pretty easy. There's a bash script you can run that'll install everything, and then you can use Rust up. We already have Rust installed here, but we want to install the Cedar command line tools, and that's in a crate called Cedar Policy CLI, I believe. Great. So that's going to be building here for a minute. It should go pretty quick. Okay, so we have the Cedar Policy command line interface installed. We can check that by just running the Cedar command, and sure enough, we see that this is installed. And what we're going to be focusing on today is using this validate command, and we'll probably see some of these other ones in future weeks. Now, to use validate, we can actually look at the help for it right away. And one thing we see is that in order to use it, we've got to have a schema. All right, so Cedar Validate requires providing a schema file. And what the schema file does is essentially specifies the types of things in your entity store, in your application. And that's going to be used to check our policies. Now, I've gone ahead and put together a schema for our application. And in our case, we've only got a few things. We've got user groups, users, and photos. And we also have some actions. So in the schema, we're defining the different kinds of entities. So, we have a user group entity type. And user groups don't have any parents or attributes, right? So user groups don't belong to any sort of larger class of thing. And so it's a really simple case. We just, make an empty record there. For users are also pretty simple for this little small demo, but they can belong to user groups. So users don't have any attributes, but they can belong to a user group or list of any number of user groups. Photos are a little bit more interesting because they do have attributes, right? So a photo is going to be a record, and it has a set of viewers, and that everything in that set of viewers is an entity that is a user group, right? So don't worry too much about the details here. The syntax is something that you can pick up pretty quick. There's good documentation on. We'll show that in a second. What I really am trying to highlight here is that basically we're just describing the types of things in our application. Now, in addition to the entities, we can also talk about the actions that can appear in authorization requests. In particular, here we only have one kind of action called view, and we can say what kinds of things can be the principal or resource for that action. So in our case, we expect that view principal should always be a user, and the resource should always be a photo. And that's important because if we go look at the policies, if we know that a view action should only be applied when the principal is a user and the resource is a photo, well, what does that mean? That means that when we're checking the attribute accesses in like a when clause, we know here that because the action was a view action, resource had to be a photo, and that's going to be the information that the Cedar validator uses to type check this whole policy. Okay, so again, we have this JSON description of the schema, which are sort of the types of things in our policy, and we can use that then to check our policies. So let's try that out. We're going to do Cedar validate. We got to give it the schema. In this case, our schema was Cedar schema.json. And we also want to ask it to check our policies in policies.cedar. And great, it passed. So according to our schema, the policy doesn't have any errors. Let's go see, though, if the validator would catch that mistake that we had made earlier, right? So here what we had done is instead of putting checking if the principal was in the resource.viewers, we'd made this typo, this mistake, and checked if the resource was in the principal viewers. So now if we go try to validate, sure enough, right, it highlights exactly what the problem is. It says, oh, you made a mistake. Viewers is not an attribute of users, right? So users don't have a viewers attribute, and it's helpfully highlighted it for us and given us the line numbers and everything. So we can go back to our policy and fix it right up. So this is a super nice tool. One other thing I'll mention real quick is that you can also just check the schema itself, make sure the schema is well formed. Here, when I'm running this, it's actually waiting for policies in standard in, but the fact that it sort of passed this meant that the schema parsed, etc. And one other thing I wanted to mention real quick is that Cedar also has a human-readable version of the schema. So it seems like people actually like the JSON version pretty well, which is fantastic. There's good VS Code support for it. But personally, I find the human-readable version a lot more intuitive. So instead of writing the JSON, you can write in this schema language, which is sort of reminiscent of Cedar itself, and you can declare the types of things in your schema. So I can just say, oh, there's an entity that's a user group. You know, it doesn't have any attributes. It doesn't have any parents. It's sort of a top-level thing. And we have another kind of thing that's an entity, which is a user, and users can be in user groups, right? So a user can have a parent that is a user group. Photos have attributes. In particular, they have a viewers attribute, and viewers is a set of users, right? Actually, I think this is basically the same thing as user group. Oh, that might be a goof. Maybe we'll check that real quick. And we can also declare actions. So here we're going to say the view action applies to requests where the principal is a user and the resource is a photo. So actually, let's see if we fix this up real quick. And now let's see if we can validate using the human readable version. So validate schema. And here, instead of using the JSON, we're going to use the human readable version. And if we want to use that, we need to pass that the schema format is human readable, and we still pass in the policies. And that worked just fine, right? So you can also use this human readable version for validation, or the JSON version. It sort of doesn't matter either way. And what's nice is that validator is going to help check our policies and make sure that we don't make those kinds of mistakes that we've seen. Now, there's a lot to talk about with schemas and validation and policies. As always, you know, there's lots of great documentation online. In particular, the Cedar language guide goes through how there's these sort of two schema formats, talks more about how you declare the types. And if you look in the human readable version, there's a nice set of examples you can go through, and sort of a fully worked example down here at the bottom that's similar to what we just saw in the video. So hopefully this helps you get going in case any of that was confusing. I think with that, we'll go ahead and call it a week, but we will see you on the next Cedar Craft. All right, folks, have a great week. Take care. Bye.